I have been taken in, Midwinter. I have been imposed on by a person who I can't help saying it who cheated me into promising what I oughtn't to have promised, and doing what I had better not have done. It isn't breaking my promise to tell you. I can trust in your discretion, can't I? You will never say a word, will you?" "Stop!" said Midwinter. "Don't trust me with any secrets which are not your own. If you have given a promise, don't trifle with it, even in speaking to such an intimate friend as I am." He laid his hand gently and kindly on Allan's shoulder. "I can't help seeing that I have made you a little uncomfortable," he went on. "I can't help seeing that my question is not so easy a one to answer as I had hoped and supposed. Shall we wait a little? Shall we go upstairs and breakfast first?" Allan was far too earnestly bent on presenting his conduct to his friend in the right aspect to heed Midwinter's suggestion. He spoke eagerly on the instant, without moving from the window. "My dear fellow, it's a perfectly easy question to answer, only" he hesitated "only it requires what I'm a bad hand at. It requires an explanation." "Do you mean," asked Midwinter, more seriously, but not less gently than before, "that you must first justify yourself, and then answer my question?" "That's it," Allan said, with an air of relief. "You've hit the right nail on the head, just as usual." Midwinter's face darkened for the first time. "I am sorry to hear it," he said, his voice sinking low, and his eyes dropping to the ground as he spoke. The rain was beginning to fall thickly. It swept across the garden, straight on the closed windows, and pattered heavily against the glass. "Sorry!" repeated Allan. "My dear fellow, you haven't heard the particulars yet. Wait till I explain the thing first." "You are a bad hand at explanations," said Midwinter, repeating Allan's own words. "Don't place yourself at a disadvantage. Don't explain it." Allan looked at him in silent perplexity and surprise. "You are my friend, my best and dearest friend," Midwinter went on. "I can't bear to let you justify yourself to me as if I was your judge, or as if I doubted you." He looked up again at Allan frankly and kindly as he said those words. "Besides," he resumed, "I think if I look into my memory I can anticipate your explanation. We had a moment's talk before I went away, about some very delicate questions which you proposed putting to Major Milroy. I remember I warned you; I remember I had my misgivings. Should I be guessing right if I guess that those questions have been in some way the means of leading you into a false position? If it is true that you have been concerned in Miss Gwilt's leaving her situation, is it also true, is it only doing you justice to believe, that any mischief for which you are responsible has been mischief innocently done?" "Yes," said Allan, speaking for the first time, a little constrainedly on his side. "It is only doing me justice to say that." He stopped, and began drawing lines absently with his finger on the blurred surface of the window pane. "You're not like other people, Midwinter," he resumed suddenly, with an effort, "and I should have liked you to have heard the particulars all the same." "I will hear them if you desire it," returned Midwinter. "But I am satisfied, without another word, that you have not willingly been the means of depriving Miss Gwilt of her situation. If that is understood between you and me, I think we need say no more. Besides, I have another question to ask, of much greater importance, a question that has been forced on me by what I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears last night." He stopped, recoiling in spite of himself. "Shall we go upstairs first?" he asked, abruptly, leading the way to the door, and trying to gain time. It was useless. Once again, the room which they were both free to leave, the room which one of them had twice tried to leave already, held them as if they were prisoners. Without answering, without even appearing to have heard Midwinter's proposal to go upstairs, Allan followed him mechanically as far as the opposite side of the window. There he stopped. "Midwinter!" he burst out, in a sudden panic of astonishment and alarm, "there seems to be something strange between us. You're not like yourself. What is it?" With his hand on the lock of the door, Midwinter turned and looked back into the room. The moment had come. His haunting fear of doing his friend an injustice had shown itself in a restraint of word, look, and action, which had been marked enough to force its way to Allan's notice. The one course left now, in the dearest interests of the friendship that united them, was to speak at once, and to speak boldly. "There's something strange between us," reiterated Allan. "For God's sake, what is it?" Midwinter took his hand from the door and came down again to the window, fronting Allan. He occupied the place of necessity which Allan had just left. It was the side of the window on which the statuette stood. The little figure, placed on its projecting bracket, was close by him on his right hand. No signs of change appeared in the stormy sky. The rain still swept slanting across the garden, and pattered heavily against the glass. "Give me your hand, Allan." Allan gave it, and Midwinter held it firmly while he spoke. "There is something strange between us," he said. "There is something to be set right which touches you nearly, and it has not been set right yet. You asked me just now where I met with Miss Gwilt. I met with her on my way back here, upon the high road on the further side of the town. She entreated me to protect her from a man who was following and frightening her. I saw the scoundrel with my own eyes, and I should have laid hands on him if Miss Gwilt herself had not stopped me. She gave a very strange reason for stopping me. She said I didn't know who his employer was." Allan's ruddy color suddenly deepened. He looked aside quickly through the window at the pouring rain. At the same moment their hands fell apart, and there was a pause of silence on either side. Midwinter was the first to speak again. "Later in the evening," he went on, "Miss Gwilt explained herself. She told me two things. She declared that the man whom I had seen following her was a hired spy. I was surprised, but I could not dispute it. She told me next, Allan, what I believe with my whole heart and soul to be a falsehood which has been imposed on her as the truth. She told me that the spy was in your employment." Allan turned instantly from the window, and looked Midwinter full in the face again. "I must explain myself this time," he said, resolutely. The ashy paleness peculiar to him in moments of strong emotion began to show itself on Midwinter's cheeks. "More explanations," he said, and drew back a step, with his eyes fixed in a sudden terror of inquiry on Allan's face. "You don't know what I know, Midwinter. You don't know that what I have done has been done with a good reason. And what is more, I have not trusted to myself. I have had good advice." "Did you hear what I said just now?" said Midwinter, incredulously. "You can't, surely, you can't have been attending to me?" "I haven't missed a word," rejoined Allan. "I tell you again, you don't know what I know of Miss Gwilt. She has threatened Miss Milroy. Miss Milroy is in danger while her governess stops in this neighborhood." Midwinter dismissed the major's daughter from the conversation with a contemptuous gesture of his hand. "I don't want to hear about Miss Milroy," he said. "Don't mix up Miss Milroy. Good God, Allan, am I to understand that the spy set to watch Miss Gwilt was doing his vile work with your approval? Once and for all, my dear fellow, will you or will you not let me explain?" "Explain!" cried Midwinter, his eyes aflame, and his hot Creole blood rushing crimson into his face. "Explain the employment of a spy? What, after having driven Miss Gwilt out of her situation by meddling with her private affairs, you meddle again by the vilest of all means, the means of a paid spy? You set a watch on the woman whom you yourself told me you loved, only a fortnight since, the woman you were thinking of as your wife. I don't believe it! I don't believe it! Is my head failing me? Is it Allan Armadale I am speaking to? Is it Allan Armadale's face looking at me? Stop! You are acting under some mistaken scruple. Some low fellow has crept into your confidence, and has done this in your name without telling you first." Allan controlled himself with admirable patience and admirable consideration for the temper of his friend. "If you persist in refusing to hear me," he said, "I must wait as well as I can till my turn comes. Tell me you are a stranger to the employment of that man, and I will hear you willingly. Suppose there should be a necessity that you know nothing about for employing him. I acknowledge no necessity for the cowardly persecution of a helpless woman." A momentary flush of irritation, momentary and no more, passed over Allan's face. "You mightn't think her quite so helpless," he said, "if you knew the truth." "Are you the man to tell the truth?" retorted the other. "You who have refused to hear her in her own defense? You who have closed the doors of this house against her?" Allan still controlled himself, but the effort began at last to be visible. "I know your temper is a hot one," he said, "but for all that your violence quite takes me by surprise. I can't account for it unless